That's a nice picture of Fabian there. I can show you my picture. I think,
That's when I get the headshot from
yeah.
university, but it was like 5 years ago.
And this picture of me, I think, is from 12 years ago. So,
Okay, so should I just stand out or camera until that happens? It looks really cute. I couldn't tell what it was from here, but I love little
okay,
birds.
now I'm hearing something in the background. Excellent. Mhm.
Okay. Hello. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to folks online. Welcome once again to our Friday seminar. Hello, folks at the back. Today we have Dr. John Kinder with us. He's going to have a presentation on his recent book. To do the introduction, we have Hannah Hagenden. She's a grad student at the Sociology Department working with Ashley Hsu on disability studies. She's online. So then she will do the introduction and then we'll continue with the presentation.
Okay. Hello, everybody.
So thank you for inviting me here today. I have such admiration for the STS department at Virginia Tech and all the work you do, and I'm thrilled that you decided to invite me back. So again, thank you. I want to preface my time today by letting you know a few things, four in particular. Okay, so the first is that I have epilepsy. And as a result, my mind doesn't work quite as well as I would like it to, particularly in the afternoon. So for that reason, I will be reading or riffing on my talk today. But I want to leave plenty of time for a Q&A afterwards. And if, you know, you got to be able to speak it, right? Forget that, right? For all kinds of reasons, including disability rights reasons, right? Read your papers, right? And feel good about it. Second, don't expect to be wowed by my facility with STS theory. I remember coming away from my cultural studies courses thinking that I was pretty much an imposter during graduate school. Later, my grad advisor told me, quote, "Theory should be like underwear. It's important, but no one needs to see it." And that's pretty much how I've survived in academia If nothing else, I hope that this book and events like this one will spur more people to think about the way zoos are, to borrow one of many such metaphors, the canaries in the coal mine when it comes to war, social unrest, environmental disruption, and so much more. Right? So with that out of the way, I want to start not with a research vignette, but with a bit of editorial feedback. Right? And for context, this book was not an easy sell. Plenty of publishers seem to have interest, right? They liked the topic, or at least they said they liked the topic, but it struck them as needlessly bleak, right? Even the marketing team at the University of Chicago Press had its doubts. Sad animal books, which was what they called them, were tough to publish. People don't want to read about animals in pain. And I received very similar advice from a different source about environmental books, right? They don't sell, okay? And in retrospect, I find this warning about sad animal books somewhat amusing, given that the description on the book jacket opens with a list of the various beasts: 6 alligators, 7 iguanas, 16 southern anacondas, 6 Indian fruit bats, a fishing cat, a binturong, a Siberian tiger, 5 magpies, an Alexandrian parakeet, 2 bullfrogs, 3 lion cubs, a cheetah, 4 wolves, and a manatee slaughtered at the London Zoo in the war's opening months. Right? So the press, it would seem, decided to lean into a blood and guts angle in trying to sell this book, despite its earlier misgivings. Yet, I'm sad to say, it turns out that the marketing folks were right to be concerned. After an early review in the Wall Street Journal, this book has received little media coverage outside of what I've managed to hustle up myself, which, to be fair, is not nothing. It was ignored by the standard review outlets: Choice, Kirkus, Library Journal, Publishers Weekly, and I actually didn't think this was possible. That I thought it was almost a rule that these people had to review your book, but no, like they all ignored it. And by academic podcasts such as New Books Network, even though I've spoken with them twice in the past. And of course, outside of zoo circles, there's been next to no interest from overseas. And just recently, in the final nail in the coffin, a group of sad animal book authors, so there's me, right? We've got a book on lab dogs, right? We've got a book on, dead pets, right? Animal Minds and Life, right? Kind of tragic horse story, right? So we all decided it would be a great idea to submit a panel on sad animal books to the Association of Writers and Writing Programs in Baltimore. The answer we received was a resounding thanks, but no thanks. Now, I should say I'm not bitter, right? Well, okay, maybe I'm a little bitter. More than anything, though, I'm a bit perplexed, right? And I don't mean to say this in the right way, but the folks who seem to read it, from World War II buffs to ex-zoo professionals, they seem to kind of like it. Indeed, all the critical feedback I've received has been positive. There just hasn't been that much of it. And I should say, too, wow, I thought I was so smart coming into this, right? I thought, you got zoos, you got war. It's like the Reese's peanut butter cup of academic topics, right? You put these two things together, who's not going to want to read about that? Well, it turns out most people don't want to read about that. And so for this reason, I keep returning to this question of what it means to write a sad animal book, right? What were the marketing team so worried about? What could they have possibly have meant? A book about unhappy animals? A book about animals that just happens to be sad? And how can we write about books about animals and serious animal issues knowing that they will inevitably bum out many readers? right? And so that's what I want to use my time today to talk about. I want to tell you about how I thought about these sorts of questions in my new book. I should say I initially wanted to call it The Ark and the Flood, a Noah. Eventually, we came up with World War Zoos, humans and other animals in the deadliest conflict of the modern age, which people seem to like, right? They like the fact that the first part is catchy. It's only 3 words, but also because they thought it didn't sound like a sad animal book. What it sounds like, according to Google, is a fictional oral history of a zombie war. So if you ever go looking for it, that's what you'll find. And yet, what do I do but open chapter 1 with the final moments in the life of what seems to me, at least, a desperately hopeless animal. So here's chapter 1, The Monkey's Lament. In July 1932, in a small railway city in the northwest of England, a resident at the Chester Zoo did the unthinkable. As happy zoo-goers looked on, a rhesus monkey chewed off a length of rope that hung in its open-air exhibit. It tied one end to a tree branch, fashioned a crude slip knot with the other, and passed its head through the noose. Then the monkey climbed to the top of the tree, let out a final scream, and leapt into space. Death, the zoo's owner, George Mottershead, told the press, was instantaneous. Okay, so that's how I begin the book. Now, at the time, zoo insiders and their allies were skeptical. E.W. McBridge, a biologist from Imperial College London, held that there had never been a proved case of suicide in all of nature. Mottershead himself viewed the hanging as nothing more than a freak accident. Yet tales of suicide would have struck a chord with readers in the decade prior to World War II. Throughout the 1930s, the press abounded with stories like this, stories of caged animals seemingly trying to end their lives. In 1933, the Sydney World News reported that a crocodile at the Johannesburg Zoo committed suicide by spending the night in its ice-cold swimming pool. That same year, a newspaper in New Zealand described how the Wellington Zoo sea lions, so-called melancholy and expensive prisoners, had taken matters into their own flippers. The story's writer insisted the popular belief is that they committed suicide on realizing that they were Wellington's guests for life. Right? Indeed, to countless Depression-era animal lovers, suicidal monkeys and mournful pinnipeds would have appeared less like freaks of nature and more like fellow victims of a world from which they badly wanted to escape. So, is this then a book about empathy, right? About how it takes sad people to recognize and care about the sadness of their fellow living creatures? Yes and no. Right? According to Laurel Breitman, a historian of animal psychology, people's fascination with suicidal animals reflects a not-so-subtle anxiety about our own demise. Writing at the height of the Spanish Civil War, Elizabeth Lee made a similar argument about wartime zoos. Public concern in her mind was little more than narcissism. If we think at all about the fate of zoos in wartime, she declared, it's only because we're worried about our own safety. Put another way, those who care about sad animals are simply looking to save their own skins. Okay, so this is something I kind of thought about a lot when writing this book. And I'm not sure I actually believe this, right? The belief that any consideration of animals is ultimately self-interested. I'd like to think that I have empathy for sad animals sake. And yet, again and again, I document humans care about animals right up until the moment that they don't. Right? Throughout the war years, indeed even in peacetime, zoos operated from a logic that some lives are more important than others, and no animal life is more important than a human one. Right? And therein lies the dilemma of writing about zoos. This is why zoos are so difficult to write about, to think about, to talk about. Zoos contain animals, right? Zoos can't exist without animals. Zoos differ from, say, museums because of animals living and breathing and eating and growling and pacing and all those sorts of things. Yet zoos aren't for animals, right? They're for humans, right? And in this sense, the subtitle of the book is accurate, right? This book is fundamentally about humans, how they prepared for the war, how they survived the war, how they rebuilt after the war, and how animals were caught in the middle, right? So in an earlier iteration of this talk, which I gave at the University of Illinois a few months ago, it's at this point that I step back and give the audience an overview of the book, right? The book as it's telling this history of how zoos survived World War II. I'm not going to do that here, in part because that's what they've asked me to do in my public talk on Monday afternoon, and I hope you'll be able to join me. And it's going to be a very different talk, right? But instead, I want to home in on a few questions I grapple with when trying to write this book, and I hope this can serve as an opportunity for all of us to kind of think about how we solve these problems as we're going about our writing. So the first is, how on earth do I structure a story like this? Like, how do I tell the history of zoos during World War II in one book, right? When World War II began, there were hundreds of zoos around the globe, from internationally recognized institutions like the Berlin Zoological Garden, the world's largest with more than 3,000 individual specimens, to countless roadside attractions, right? I know that from the very beginning, I knew that certain zoos, right, the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., the London Zoo in Regent's Park, Tokyo's Ueno Zoo, for example, they would appear with some regularity, if only because I could use them, right, these big zoos, these important zoos, to illustrate some larger questions, some larger trends. Ultimately, I decided I'd borrow my organizational structure from what I call the Barnes & Noble School of World War II history. And even if you don't study World War II, you don't know about World War II. If you've ever been to Barnes & Noble, you kind of know what I'm talking about. Those single volume accounts of World War II that are typically stacked up in the sales rack. And if you ever pick them up, they're all basically the same, right? They all kind of sound the same. They all look the same. They follow the same structure. They start in the 1930s, or in World War II dad speak, the coming of the war, right? So you got your coming of the war chapter, cover the rise of Hitler, the breakdown of the international order, the Spanish Civil War, right? And then we're off to the races with the start of the war in Europe, okay? The Barnes & Noble School of World War II history teaches us at this point you pretty much stay close to the hip with the Wehrmacht, right? So stay close to the German army. So which means you start by pivoting east to Poland, right? Into Ukraine, right? And then from there you turn back the other way. You go to the invasion of the Low Countries, the fall of France. And with these books, at some point, you, as a World War II historian, you have to figure out, all right, when do I stop and do this all over again with the Pacific, right? You basically have to do it, Europe grinds along and then stop. Now back to the 1930s in Japan, and you make your way all the way up again. But, the World War II, that's how these books work. But eventually, about halfway through the book, all the major players are involved. And from there, you simply work your way from Africa to Normandy, from Midway to Iwo Jima, till it's a straight shot to Berlin, the Holocaust, and the atomic bomb. Right? That's how these books work. And that's basically what I do in this book, right? By the way, here's George Mottershead. And there's a rhesus monkey. Starting the Great Depression, I cover all of the World War II hits. Right? We get to Nazism, we get to concentration camps, we get to Blitzkrieg, we get to the Blitz, right? We get to Pearl Harbor, we get to strategic bombing, the siege of Leningrad, occupation and looting, collaboration and resistance, rationing and victory gardens, propaganda, the Battle of Berlin, even the infamous Bridge Too Far makes a brief appearance, right? All of it from the perspective of the zoo, right? So in other words, I want to take that structure of this kind of typical World War II single volume book and just make it everything from the perspective of the zoo. Rise of Nazism, perspective of the zoo. Concentration camps, perspective of the zoo. Fall of France, perspective of the zoo, right? So that was my solution of how to make sense of this. Does it work, right? I sort of think so. I mean, the book rips along at a fairly rapid pace with just enough narrative spine that allows me to hold things together, right? And it lets me toss in lots of interesting tidbits, lots of interesting, to me at least, anecdotes without straying too far from a familiar chronology, right? A chronology that in the kind of dad World War II reader would recognize. Like, he'd be able to follow this story, right, from the perspective of the zoo. That said, I think the answer to does it work ultimately depends upon whether you think the endeavor is worth it in the first place, right? Which leads me to the what am I even doing here question, right? And I know all of us as scholars have wrestled with this to one degree or another, right? What's What does it mean to think about zoos in the face of genocide in Gaza and the federal government's war on science and everything else that's bad about the world right now? Like, what does it mean to think about zoos right now? And I'm reminded of two moments in the book, right? So the first occurs in August 1936, right? When members of the International Union of Directors of Zoological Gardens, which was the major group of zoo directors at the time, largely in Europe with a few from North America. They decided to meet in 1936 for a week-long gathering in Cologne. Right now, at this point, the Nazification of German zookeeping would have been impossible for anyone to ignore. From the swastikas and the exhibits, to the Nazi propaganda, to the firing of Jewish employees, right? And yet the continent's top zoo men seemed content to ignore all of that stuff, right? And instead focus on zoo matters, right? Focus on the running of the zoos and a lot of sightseeing in Germany, right? And I always think about that same thing, right? I think about, like, if someone were to kind of write my history looking back, and I should say, like, when talking about this, I'm like super snarky and I'm very, like, judgmental about, like, how could they focus on zoo when the world was going to hell? Like, and I can't help but imagine, like, what if some grad student in the future is looking at me saying, like, what the hell was he doing? Focusing on this, doesn't he see what's going on around him? Later, I referenced the fact that under fascist occupation, untold numbers of Europeans opted for what's described as internal emigration, shutting out the world and losing themselves in books, art, intellectual pursuits, and yes, even zoos. And at times, that's how I feel, right? That I've chosen to devote myself to the most trivial of pursuits, watching monkeys, petting wallabies, both of which I do. Even as, thanks to climate change, the world quite literally burns, right? A topic I discuss at the end of the book. Now, of course, at this point, I might self-interestedly say that actually now is precisely the time to talk about zoos. That's because zoos don't represent a refuge from authoritarian thinking. Quite the opposite, right? This is why so many World War II era strongmen, Mussolini, Goering, Franco, Goebbels, even Churchill, were avid zoo goers, right? The worst zoos resemble family-friendly prisons, where in the words of philosopher Brian Masumi, animal incarceration is converted into fun. Okay? The very best are no less committed to sentencing animals to lives of confinement and display. They're just better at disguising their efforts and the logic behind them. Consider, for example, the question of whether and when zoos should slaughter their animal stock. Okay. This issue came up again and again throughout World War II, and as time went on, greater numbers of zoo folk came to the grim calculation that some animals were better off dead. Right? And I'll give you one example. I'll give you an example from the London Zoo. So on September 1st, 1939, London Zoo staff gassed the black widow spiders and beheaded the entire collection of venomous reptiles. Among them, 10 cobras, a pair of puff adders, 3 diamondback rattlesnakes, and 5 Gila monsters. But that was just the beginning. Over the following few months, keepers dispatched more than 200 mammals, reptiles, and birds. Right? Animals that were plentiful, or at the time, as they were described, easy to replace, were prime candidates for the chopping block, as were those with limited entertainment appeal, such as various breeds of indistinguishable antelope, right? You know, they all kind of look the same. Right? The most vulnerable, the most justifiably killable were animals whose meat value outweighed their zoological significance. Right? Alive, they were a drain on resources. Dead, they could help feed the charismatic carnivores that drew in visitors. Reflecting on all of this, I write in the book, there's something deeply unsettling. There's something deeply unsettling about the devaluing of life inherent in such calculations, particularly as it mirrors the genocidal logic that was already beginning to play out across Western Europe. Zoos operated from a mental calculus that suggested that some lives are more important than others. No animal life is more important than a human one. I've used that line already. As the war dragged on, as food supplies grew short and the threat of occupation and bombardment increased, more and more lives came to be viewed as disposable, to be sacrificed in the name of some greater good. This is not to suggest that zoo directors or London pet owners were closet Nazis, or that they shared some of Hitler's fantasies of extermination, though some certainly did. Rather, the uncomfortable parallels come from a deeper place, a shared archive of ideas upon which Western culture itself is built. From the great chain of being to 19th century race science, the West has ranked, ordered, and assigned different value to different components of the living world. Zoos were just one manifestation of that legacy. Auschwitz was another. The atomic bomb, a weapon designed to kill enemy civilians en masse to save one's own, yet another. Okay. So, to be sure, killing animals is nothing new at the peacetime zoo. Right? Zoos kill animals every day. Right? They kill pests, they kill vermin, they kill food animals, they kill animals whose whole purpose is to be consumed by others, they kill the sick, they kill the unsightly, and on occasion, they kill the ones that make headlines. And when most people kind of think about these things, they, you can justify it. They try to justify it, and I can. When I sort of see this, I say, you can justify this all you want. You can say, well, those ones don't really count, right? Or those ones aren't real animals. But of course, when it suits their purpose, zoos are happy to put on display rats and mice and the kinds of primates that are cut up and carved for the sake of science, and dogs and cats. Basically, anything is better than an empty cage, right? If you go to the zoo, you're going to a place that makes ruthless, often invisible decisions about which animals are worthy of our attention and which ones make more ecological, economic, and entertainment sense as ground into some kind of protein pellet. So, one of the big arguments I make in this book is that World War II was not a state of exception, right? A state of exception that introduced new ethical dilemmas to zoo life. Rather, the war simply forced zoo leaders to grapple with publicly with the sort of dilemmas non-zoo folk rarely hear about, right? And so that's kind of one of part of the story that I think when people hear about this project, they'll say like, oh, wow, zoo, wartime, that would have been hard, right? They would have had to done things that would have, they never would have had to do and so forth. And I say, no, that's exactly wrong, right? The only difference is that war forced difficult questions, difficult practices, uncomfortable, out into the public where we could see them. And there were all kinds of reasons for this. Some having to do with national security, some having to do with where they got their resources and so forth. But yeah, so it was not a state of exception. But grappling with sad animal questions, right, of the sort that we're not used to thinking about, of the sort that come up again and again in a book like this one, asks a lot of the reader. And I'm not sure I was up to the task. And I'll tell you what I mean. So maybe you're unlike me, right? Maybe you're the sort of writer who has, depending upon what they're doing, has command of vocabulary, command of ways of thinking about writing, right? Command, the ability to sort of shape shift as a writer as it fits the material you're working on. For whatever reason, I don't have that, right? I've got a few go-to moves that have allowed me to sort of survive in this industry. But my first instinct as a writer is to shock. It's to ridicule. It's to adopt a sarcastic stance. It's to seek out the best example of the worst possible practice, right? In other words, in reading this, there's a bit of me that says, oh, you think you like zoos? Let me do this. I'm going to point the finger at you, and I'm going to say, like that, right? Like that. Like, that's how I work, right? That's I don't know what that is. That's easy enough in a book like this one. Over the course of World War Zoos, I describe often in detail all sorts of John, Tonki, and Hanoko. The Ueno Zoo's elephants were sentenced to death in 1943 by the Tokyo Governor General. He believed that the Japanese people did not understand the meaning of sacrifice, and so, in a form of propaganda killing, a number of the high-profile animals at the Tokyo Zoo were killed, right? Several bears were strangled to death. A rattlesnake had an electrode stuck into its skull to see if it would kill. And eventually, they wound up just cutting his head off because they're hard to kill. But the most famous elephants, or the most famous animals, were the elephants, right? First, they tried to poison them, then they tried to shoot them, but basically, they believed that the best way to kill them was to intentionally starve them. So these tricks, and there was a sense of bewilderment, right? Why aren't they getting fed? And they get slowly dying, and I describe in great detail how an elephant dies, right? So I do that. Readers who read this book learn how to dismantle an elephant corpse to retrieve the grease. Basically, most elephants carry their fat around the eye sockets, and especially here. So cut off the foot, stick it in a bin, boil it all off, right? We learn about that and how people did that. They're treated to the story, likely apocryphal, about a gibbon whose hands were torn away in a bombing raid. This is at the Dresden Zoo. When the keeper approached, the wounded creature held out its bloody stumps, begging for help. I say this is partly apocryphal. Also, both people on the far left and kind of like neo-Nazi types love this story, right? And that's where if you see it anywhere, you'll likely to see it on kind of neo-Nazi-ish websites. Early readers of my, I relate the story of a sea lion that was shipped to Washington, D.C. for safekeeping, only to be tortured and killed by vandals, American kids. I also tell how, when stashed in a cafe during an air raid, a chimpanzee at the Rotterdam Zoo smashed glasses and beat a capuchin monkey to death, right? And I go on and on and on, right? So lots of animal horror. And early readers of the manuscript warned me about this sort of thing. They warned me about the danger of losing my audience. They would be so traumatized by the relentless descriptions of animal suffering, again, my go-to move, that they'd eventually tune out, right? Even my wife, for the longest time, swore she would never read the book. She couldn't read the book. Stories of animal death were simply too disturbing, right? She eventually did, and her verdict was basically the same as what she, whenever I'm trying to show her a movie that I really like, and she's like, I can see how it's good. It's just not for me, right? And that's how she responded to World War Zoos, right? So, but that's about as good as I could hope for. And so, what about the readers who, like zoos, right? Zoo haters are going to read this book, and I should say most people who've read this book so far tend to be kind of the anti-zoo ilk. So will plenty of folks, I hope, who have fond memories of zoo experiences. People who work at zoos, people who want zoos to be good, right? What am I saying about them? I think back to the end of chapter 8 in the book, in which I riff on a Dutch journalist's description of life under German occupation. Writing in the New York Times in August 1940, Oscar Moore wrote this of his fellow countrymen and women. Their life could be compared to the fate of animals in a modern zoo. There are no visible fences. The animals are supposed to behave as if they were free within limits. Their keepers are as correct and humane as possible. They even show a certain liking for the inmates of the vast and beautiful garden. The lower animals every now and then forget their new condition. Domestic animals accept their change with inscrutable placidity. At first glance, it seems an absurd comparison, especially the bit about German occupying forces being as correct and humane as possible. Flip the metaphor, however, and Moore's observation is more unsettling still. Visiting the zoo is like playing tourist in a nation under military occupation. Only the sheep accept their captive status, and every zookeeper looks like a Nazi. I will admit, there were several times throughout this book where it's like, am I calling people who like zoos Nazis? And what does that mean? Do I even believe that, right? I come across material like this, and I'm working on my language, trying to sort of say, like, hey, I'm not doing this, but I'm doing this. Again, early readers warned me about going too far too early. Some arguments readers don't want to hear, right? Particularly those that can feel too accusatory, right? As if I'm pointing a finger at judgment at anyone who dared to have fun at their local zoo. Even so, I could not put off the most difficult topic forever, and that would be the relationship between zoos and the Holocaust. This, I know, is dangerous territory. Right? To those who view the genocide of Europe's Jews as a singular event, unrivaled in its lethality and scale, right? Playing loose or fast and loose with Holocaust analogies risks trivializing the final solution's epic horror. This is especially the case when it comes to humans' treatment of animals. As PETA discovered in the backlash to its 2003-2004 campaign, Holocaust on Your Plate, right? Since that time, the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg has upheld a ban by German authorities on activists using Holocaust imagery to protest factory farming of animals. Yet the connections were everywhere during World War II. Several concentration camps had zoos, including Buchenwald, right? Buchenwald the zoo was set up not long after it opened. In fact, if you've ever been, you know where it's at. There was the big kind of yard where the prisoners would assemble, and there would be a barbed wire fence, and then right across that, about 10 feet away, was the zoo, right? There would be the bear pit and so forth. This is a handmade sign made by the prisoners that says, to the zoological garden Buchenwald, showing some of the animals that were kept there. Prisoners had to march past this, the idea being that they were no better than animals in a zoo. This is a written poem by, or an illustrated poem by a prisoner who was held at Buchenwald. It's called A Bear Hunt in KZ Buchenwald. Basically tells the story of Betty the bear. Betty was housed in the bear exhibit. She eventually goes AWOL. She escapes, and she is hunted down and killed. The labor for running the zoo was carried out by the prisoners. If you were a prisoner at Buchenwald, basically working at the zoo was one of the best jobs there was. Not because people necessarily liked the animals, but because you could get scraps of their food. The animals at Buchenwald always ate better than the humans, right? Here's a scene of the little bear mountain, and the poem ends with they've hunted down Betty, and the prisoners are starving. And on the one hand, they're torn, because on the one hand, they are Betty, right? They relate to Betty because they too are prisoners. On the other hand, they're salivating over Betty's roasted corpse, and the camp guards won't let them eat any of Betty. So Buchenwald had a zoo, so did Sachsenhausen, so did other places. So did the killing center at Treblinka. Here you can see Treblinka extermination camp. The zoo is right by the Ukrainian guards, right? So here. Unlikely that if you were taken to Treblinka and exterminated, you would have ever seen it, and I talk about that. The zoo, Treblinka housed pigeons, squirrels, foxes, and other small mammals in its zoo corner. We had a number of marvelous birds here, recalled the former camp commander Franz Stengel, then serving a life sentence in a Dusseldorf prison for mass murder. He's relating this in the 1970s. An expert from Vienna designed it for us. More important still, the zoo emerged as one of the most potent metaphors for framing the Holocaust experience. And those who endured it. Recalling the debased atmosphere of life in the Lutz ghetto, for example, one survivor recalled, it was like a zoo. It was animalistic. We lived not a human life. We developed a numbness, dreamlike state. And if you read, survivors' testimony from the camps, from the ghettos, even from a few from the killing center, you come across this again and again. Now, I'm not saying that zoo was the dominant metaphor for understanding the camp experience, but it was definitely there, right? It was there at all times. Over and over and over again, people sort of say, it was like a zoo, it was a zoo, I was a creature like a zoo. Which leads me to ask, if concentration camps are like zoos, can we ever look at zoos the same way again? The answer to this, I think, is clearly no, and I say as much. But I also make sure to bring in camp survivors and their relatives to make this argument for me. I'm not the one calling you a Nazi for liking a zoo. And of course, I'm a hypocrite, right? I still go to zoos for research, right? There's part of me that really likes zoos. No, I leave that to the people like Jewish novelist Isaac Bashevis Singer, who in 1968 famously wrote, in relation to animals, all humans, whoops, I can't use the computer. In relation to animals, all people are Nazis. For the animals, it is an eternal Treblinka. And I should say, too, that one of my most satisfying moments with this is I just gave a talk for the World War II discussion forum, which is mainly older people. And I hadn't even gotten to the Holocaust, and someone said, you know, the way you talk about the way people like make these judgments at the zoo, that sounds a lot like the Holocaust. And I was like, yes, you know, like, thank you. You know, I'm not making this up. So I know as my time draws to a close, I want to say that World War Zeus is not an entirely sad animal book, not in my mind at least. There are plenty of stories of courage and survival, of animals resisting their captivity, of people risking their lives to save zoo animals and other vulnerable populations. There are some very bleak observations that I make about climate change and about how zoos have failed to come to terms with their histories of war and colonialism. Still, I try to make it, you know, I think sad, but I don't go searching for the bright side of things either, right? And on that note, I want to conclude by reading another passage from the book that I think you'll agree is a bit of a downer. It concerns a 15-year-old Japanese schoolgirl and her friend on August 9th, 1945. Okay. Mishi Hattori was taking shelter near the rear of a cave when the bomb exploded over Nagasaki. A searing hot flash accompanied the light that blasted me. For a second, I dimly saw it burn the girls standing in front of the cave. They appeared as bowling pins, falling in all directions, screaming and slapping at their burning school uniforms. I saw nothing for a while after that. Partially blinded, her body racked with pain, she picked her way toward their school, barely comprehending the horror of her surroundings. My classmate, Fumiko, scampered about 50 meters ahead of us. When I looked up to see why she was calling, I saw her pointing to a large form on the ground. "Look over there," she shouted. "It has escaped from the zoo. It's an alligator." It lay in our path to the school, so we approached with caution. Fumiko found a rock. She drew back the rock above her head as she approached the creature. Then Fumiko froze in her tracks, screaming hysterically. I ran to her side. The face looking up at us from the crawling creature was human. I could see it pleading for something, probably water. No clothes or hair were visible, just large, gray, scale-like burns covering its head and body. The skin around its eyes had burned away, leaving the eyeballs huge and terrifying. Whether male or female, I never found out. Ours is not the place to judge the actions of a schoolgirl on the day her entire world was turned to hell. And yet, there's something telling about young Fumiko's actions in this moment. Her first instinct was to kill, to strike the alligator dead. Perhaps she'd heard too many stories about what would happen if zoo animals ever broke free. Perhaps she thought she was doing her patriotic duty, protecting her fellow residents from the threat of a man-eater on the loose. Or perhaps, and I think this is more likely, Fumiko wasn't thinking at all. She was reacting on gut instinct. An alligator was out of place. It was uncaged, it was a threat, and it needed to be destroyed. Zoos send many messages, but the most consequential is that wild animals and humans belong to separate worlds, one in nature, the other in civilization, one in captivity, the other looking in from the outside. In this sense, at least, Fumiko's reaction was not only understandable, it was exactly what zoos had been cultivating in one way or another since the war began. Thank you. And so my friend sent me this to cheer me up. So yeah, so if you have any questions, I'm happy to do my best to try to answer them. So. Yeah.
But thanks so much. This is a very impressive and also astonishing. Oh, it's okay. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So again, this is very astonishing, also very impressive talk. I just learned a lot, and also make me think to think more about my relationship with laboratory mice, because I used to work in a lab. We did a lot of animal experiments, and especially kind of like make me to recall the pandemic time, because we started our experiments right before a week before the lockdown, or the semi-lockdown in Taiwan. So during the time, we all got like a notice from the office who in charge of the whole animal laboratory to say that yes, if the things escalate, or if they rise up the lockdown level or the security level, then all your ongoing experiments need to be terminated or need to meet your endpoints. Mm-hmm. It kind of remind me a lot about this experiment during the pandemic time, and also how we think about, oh yeah, it is not only our experiment, but there are also mice, and then how we then if we really end those lives, and then how we not only how we do our experiment, but also think about how we treat them, and also what this kind of lives meaning to people, especially during this kind of pandemic time. But also, like you said, as a lab doing a lot of animal experiments, we continuously managing breedings, and then killing mice, and then we call it sacrifice. But it also connect to, the those zoo in Tokyo, Japan, mm-hmm. that they want to use elephants as example to show the martyrs of how can you sacrifice to the emperor, or how can you sacrifice yourself to the Imperial Japan. So I think what I already get a little bit about how zookeeper, or how those people who manage animals in the zoo think about animal and think about their relationship with animals. But I just want to learn more about what's the logic behind managing a zoo, or maybe I just want to know more about what's the science of management of animals in the zoo.
Well, so that science of management would not have been fully developed by the time I'm writing, right? So, so by the 1940s, we're kind of in a really interesting moment. Prior to the 19th century, the people who typically ran the zoos either came from kind of a carnival background. They came from like a P.T. Barnum kind of background. Or they came from, they were animal traders, right? A lot of kind of people who were importing a lot of animals, right? They eventually opened up collections, and then they became zoos. Hagenbeck Zoo in Germany, one of the most famous zoos in the world. Like, that's how it started, outside of Hamburg. So by the time you get to the 1940s, there's starting to be a professionalization of zoos. So a lot of people who are running zoos starting to have PhDs, starting to have degrees in veterinary science, starting to kind of be biologists, right? This would accelerate in the aftermath of the war, but World War II is right on the cusp. So the leading zoo, this is what they were called. They were called zoo men, right? So the leading zoo man in Germany was a guy named Lutz Heck. His father ran the Berlin Zoo. His brother ran the Munich Zoo. He took over the Berlin Zoo. He was a scientist. He thought about himself. He had a PhD, right? And people like Heck were very much invested in this idea of professionalizing the zoo and basically trying to separate itself from this kind of 19th century, roadside kind of carnival sort of circus, right? But in 1930s and 1940s, that transition had not completely taken place. So basically, the person who was running the San Diego Zoo, she had no animal experience, right? She started basically as a secretary, right? Now, during World War II, she was the only woman who ran a major zoo. But so there were a lot of people who just started working at the zoo and they kind of made their way up, or people who had animal collections and so forth. But at a lot of the, the top tier zoos, there started to become this kind of aim toward promoting a kind of more scientific understanding and management of the zoo. The zoos are completely different today. I mean, you basically can't get a job at the zoo in anything doing animals without having a bachelor's degree at the very least, right? So they're very different, and there's whole kinds of industries involved in, just like with everything else, providing, all of the food, all of the things for cages, all that sort of thing. So it's much more professionalized than it was in this moment. This moment is still kind of right at that turning point between a kind of an aim toward a professional scientific association and then this kind of older scholar gentleman, run place that, that's how like the London Zoo, for example, like begins from these like older kind of scholar gentleman sort of figures like Darwin and others, Raffles. But and if you're interested in this topic, I'm sure like you all know this, but there was a great book that came out this year called Lab Dog by Brad Bowman. He's a historian, and it's all about sort of the laboratory use of beagles and talking about the ways in which beagles came to be viewed as like the sort of experimental animal for all kinds of reasons, and the history behind that, but also the industry and the politics behind that as well. And he really gets into a lot of that. But I appreciate when you sort of mentioned that, you talked about how kind of sacrifice, because when it comes to zoos, particularly kind of the uglier side of zoos, there's a lot of euphemism, right? There's a lot of like very creative and strategic language, and a lot of which sort of gives a sense of autonomy to animals that are like literally stuck in cages, like, as if it's sort of their own choice, right? And so, one thing that zoos will try to do is they're always wrestling this. On the one hand, they want to kind of give in to this idea that animals have lots of autonomy and almost a sense of free will, like especially during wartime. So there were all kinds of things where they would have, they would give chimps like these fake guns and have them shoot pictures of Hirohito, for example, at the Detroit Zoo, or where it's like, look, see how patriotic these animals are, right, and so forth. Like, look, they're all in it together, and so we can connect with them. On the other hand, if you sort of push that too far, where you say, like, wow, they can kind of make decisions and so forth, and yet we're people in a cage, so you can only kind of humanize them to a certain extent, and zoos are always running into trouble with that, right? Give something a name, and then we're going to like slaughter it in front of you. Like that's tough, and so you'll often see when you go to zoos, certain animals have names, certain animals are just kind of anonymous, certain animals have numbers, right? So, and that's kind of how you sort of see them in the pecking order. Yeah, I don't think I answered your question at all, but yeah.
So we have a question in the chat from Ashley. So human zoos, ethnologically, expositions happen in the United States and not unrelated to freak shows. Can you say something about the relationship between animal studies and disability studies? Just thinking of some of your other work here too.
Oh, I'm terrible at questions like this. No, I mean, I should say that yes, one of the hallmarks of, and this isn't answering the question, but I'll see if I can walk around it. You know, one of the questions, or one of the kind of not high points. I was in Paris, and you know, right next to the Vincennes Zoo, right? You know, there's like a park, and like there's a lot of like high weeds and things like that. And if you actually start like walking through that, you can see kind of the old exposition, or old kind of huts and things like that from the 1932 French colonial exposition, right? They're still there, right? You know, and you can sort of see the ways in which, and that's where the zoo came from. That's where the modern Paris Zoo comes from. And you know, so you can kind of see this clear link between the zoo and what was essentially this kind of human zoo, where you know people, various indigenous people of North America, South America, Asia, the Arctic, were put on display for as kind of to demonstrate to Parisians, you know, the value of their empire, right? And so, you know, the link between empire, the link between that and zoos, human zoos or regular zoos, is you know, always been there. Now, in terms of the link between disability studies and animal studies, yeah. She knows this answer to this question better than I do. So all I can say is that, so I kind of started in disability studies, right? My first book is on disabled veterans, and I'm kind of working on a disability stuff right now. And I got into animal studies in part for personal reasons, political reasons. But, you know, I think for me, you know, the one thing that I often talk about when I think about my students is just this process of animalization. You know, the ways in which so many disabled people throughout, you know, American history, which is what I specialize in, have been categorized as, or as, you know, animalistic, as not fully human, as not fully civilized, as essentially as animals. There's this, you know, really great kind of fundamental disability history piece by a scholar named Douglas Baton, where he sort of talks about the ways in which justification of inequality of certain groups, how inequality is justified by making certain groups seem disabled, right? And so he talks about African Americans, he talks about immigrants, and he talks about women. Basically saying something like, you know, women can't go to college, or the argument being that women shouldn't go to college, right? And otherwise, they will lose their reproductive ability, right? In other words, like, if they get education, they will become disabled, right? So the idea being that disability is used to justify the secondary status of women. So, and I think animalization works the exact same way. If disability is used to justify the inequality of certain groups, animalization is used to justify the inequality of disabled people. So, and I should also say too that, you know, there are so many kind of the ways, and so I guess that's what I would kind of focus on. Like I really focus on the ways in which certain categories of being disabled, disability, being animal, are used to justify kind of inequality without a real interrogation of what they mean, right? You know, without sort of like just kind of taken for granted, right? It's taken for granted that it's okay to put animals in an institution. It's taken for granted that it's okay for us to make these decisions about these animals should die because we're afraid that they're going to get out, right? It's taken for granted that we have that authority. And that same taken for grantedness is central to the way I see disability operating in American history. That is not at all what she asked, but like that's kind of what I can come up with after talking for an hour and a half.
Thank you for a talk, but I have to say I'm glad it was over because it was so hard to hear. But it was really important. I had a question about your thoughts on some of the scholarship that's been coming out in sort of the feminist multi-species work that really tries to talk about the intersections of violence and care in these very, difficult, oppressed spaces, and possibilities of politics in those spaces from, thinking about the kind of care and affordances possible in these animalized kind of spaces. And I was wondering, is that the right kind of scholarship to be doing? Right. I'm wondering, curious, because from your stories, it's like, sure, there might have been some care, but ultimately it was a structural condition that foreclosed anything else to happen. So I was wondering what you kind of think of that kind of scholarship that's coming out.
Can you
right?
say more about, give a specific?
Like, I was thinking of Juno Perennia's Decolonizing Extinction. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Am.
Yeah.
I should say, I am familiar with this work, but I am not fluent in this work, right? I touch on it, in some of my kind of conversations with various people and so forth, but I don't think I can give you a very good understanding of it. I mean, I think what I will say is that I think there are very structural difficulties with the zoo, right? So on the one hand, there's a historian named Nigel Rothbells. He kind of writes about this progressivist history of the zoo, right? Which essentially says that in the past, zoos were bad, but today they are good, right? Or at the very least, they are better, right? And this is the story we like to tell ourselves. And of course, once we start to kind of get into this, we see that actually that's not the case. But I find myself, when kind of working with zoo people, when I interview them, when I talk to them and so forth, they are very much aware of this, and they very much are aware that they are working with within the structure of what a zoo can be, right? So and I'll give you kind of an example of this. So I was at the San Diego Zoo, and I was talking to someone, and I was like, oh, they were doing the seal show, and I was like, oh, what do you think about that? And this keeper, she said, look, the people who run this place, they want to turn it into Disney World, right? They want to bring in rides. They want to bring it, turn it into Busch Gardens, right? In other words, they want to turn it into this amusement park. And I'm trying to do I'm the adult in the room, right? I'm trying to kind of do the best possible ethical work on behalf of these animals. Zoo work is low paying. Zoo work is, 75% of zoo workers are women, as opposed to the period I'm talking about where basically 99% of them were men, right? So in other words, as zoo work becomes feminized, the pay goes way down. Most of the people who are working at a zoo are true believers, right? They're really risking something to kind of do this work. So the question is whether or not this, to what extent they can without kind of reimagining the zoo. So all of this is a way of saying that, I am familiar with that work. And I can, but I don't feel like I have a good enough answer to your question. I'm much more familiar with people kind of rethinking the zoo, but part of what I talk about is, there is work, that I am more familiar with on the ways in which kind of thinking about kind of the how kind of violence against women, violence against animals sort of collapse into each other and so forth. But I haven't really looked at it kind of on the other side, so I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
So this is a theory question. Are you wearing underwear? No. Actually, I have a question about crafts. I really appreciate how you try to explain, why you choose the stories you choose. And having just written a book myself, I knew why I chose the stories for each chapter, but it was really helpful to reflect on your comments to figure out like, oh, here's why I did it this way across the book. So I'm curious if your normal mode is to like, I want to use stories to horrify. As you're writing the arc of the project, whether you kind of juxtapose that with other kinds of stories in using those moves to make the case that you wanted to make.
Yes, I mean, you know, I have written in the past about animal resistance. You know, that doesn't come up that much in this specific book. What does come up in this book is you know, because like at some point I had to kind of come around to the idea that this is ultimately a human story, right? And so when I talk about the resistance, like I talk about kind of how the zoo sort of figures in kind of, you know, kind of classic World War II resistance. So I talk about, I mean, there's this famous book, Zookeeper's Wife, it's all about housing people, you know, Jewish people at the Warsaw Zoo. And that one's kind of covered. I mean, I touch on that, but I spent a lot of time talking about the zoo in Amsterdam artists that also kind of was used to hide people from basically the German work, you know, forced labor requirements, but also Amsterdam Jews, and you know the zoo is in the Jewish quarter, right? In fact, like right across from the zoo is an old kind of theater, and that was where the German occupiers would bring all of the Jewish people of Amsterdam, and before kind of sending them off to, I think, Bergen-Belsen and various camps and so forth. So like they literally, the road to the Holocaust led past the gates of the artist zoo, right? And so I kind of talk about the zookeeper who ran the zoo and about how he thought about resistance, how he thought about like his kind of ethical responsibility to the people who, you know, and how he used the architecture of the zoo to help people and so forth. But I also sort of talk about, in terms of like an uplifting story, there are a couple of stories. I talk about a zoo in Heart Mountain Incarceration Center in Wyoming, right? So some people at the, who were interned, you know, Japanese Americans, they built their own petting zoos because they were, the government did not allow them pets, right? And I sort of talk about some of, you know, why they did that, but also kind of the anguish they felt about having to leave their animals behind. But I mean, in many ways, and I don't talk about it that much, but one of my favorite parts of the book talks about the ways in which Jewish Germans who were trying to who escaped the ghetto, one of the places where they would go and meet up was the zoo, right? You know, and if you ever see like, I was watching one just the other day. A lot of spy movies have zoos and so forth, because zoos are really interesting places. You know, the architecture is set up so that you can kind of be always in motion. And the idea is that, you know, it's at a zoo, unlike most places, including street corner, you can loiter. You're expected to loiter, and your vision, your gaze, is pointed this way. So if you ever see zoos in spy movies, it will usually be someone standing right here, and then someone will walk up to them. They're both looking forward, and they both have a conversation, right? The zoo as a space of refuge is really kind of notable for that, and people recognize it. And you know, I talk about one very famous Jewish resistance fighter who talked about going to the zoo, and he said, you know, and he went undercover as a Protestant, right? So he dyed his hair blonde, and basically he said, you know, when I'm walking around my fellow Germans, like all I see is like hate and you know, I see the enemy. But I walk into the zoo and I'm finally at peace. Like, you know, it's like only with the animals, like only with, like the zoo was the only place that he did not feel that constant sort of gaze of that terror of being watched at all time. And so, you know, this is the place in which both, you know, it's not nothing that many Holocaust camp survivors and so forth came away with this thinking like, I know what it's like to be an animal in a cage. I don't know what it's like to be treated as an animal, categorized as animal, like, you know, according to like race laws, like classed as animal, right? Fed like an animal, right? And so when I get out of this, I see animals in a completely different way. So I try to, as much as possible, kind of bring in those stories. You know, I have a whole chapter on kind of the question of labor and how German and zoos basically use slaves. Allied zoos hired women, right, for the first time. But then, of course, at the end of the war, they all get fired, right? You know, but so like I kind of tell these stories about sort of the daily life of the zoo and that sort of thing. But you know, like even with what I'm working on now, it's even more kind of story focused and story narrative. But that's, you know, and I know I've gone on. I'll say this one last thing. But you know, as a historian, you know, we have examples. So my last book was on disabled veterans, and you know, at some point I had my chapter on rehabilitation, and I had to say like, and I literally talking to someone like, how many examples of people like being rehabilitated do I need to give for the audience to be correct, you know, to be convinced? Like at first I had 6. He was like, you don't need 6. Like, you know, 3 is plenty. And so I have hundreds of these. Which ones do I choose, right? You know, because literally, depending on which ones I choose, like they will be written into history, and the others don't, right? And so, you know, I'm looking at them like, okay, you know, all right, well, I already have an amputee, so I can't have 2, right? You know, like, oh, I've already got this, and like, let's see if I can, you know, spread it around. Like, I've got this one from Mississippi, so do I have any Pacific Northwest? You know, do I? And so you make these kinds of decisions that's not based on anything. Like, all of them would have worked, but and so that's why I think this story of craft is like so important. I'm not saying it's the best book in the world, like, but I am saying that I give a lot of thought to that stuff. What I don't give a lot of thought to are these kinds of questions that are, you know, like these big theoretical questions that I should give thought to, but I, for some reason, wind up thinking about those. So, and that would be my one thing I would say, that I would hope that more of us in our teaching, in our graduate education, but also in talking with other scholars, like I'm always up to talk about writing, like literally, how did you get to page 2? Because I would have never thought of getting there the way you did, right? So I think these kinds of questions are interesting, but you know, the one I really and I appreciate your point about I'm glad it's over, right? Because you know, I was shopping it around to the writing group and so forth, and they're like, you can't give us this in the first paragraph. Like, you can't do this in the first. You're going to lose people. Right? And like, it's a weird thing to think about when I think like, I don't know, my disabled veteran book is pretty bloody. Like, it's like, there's a lot of like nasty stuff in that, you know. No one would ever said like, oh, you're going to lose people if you talk about like, you know, people suffering in hospital. But something about that animal, like, I can't hear it. And that's both an opportunity and an obstacle, right? Like I said, I don't know if I figured it out. Like, I mean, I think my point of this is that I probably didn't, but it's something that like that had me thinking, that still sort of keeps me up at night. Like, you know, how do you talk about these things when people say like, I don't want to hear it, or I can't hear it? Like, that's the more interesting thing. So anyway.
So we have Fabian with his hand raised, so we'll go ahead and go to him.
Hey, thank you for your presentation. I'm also interested in your framing of writing because I'm also in the process of thinking about it as a historian. And I wanted to see how writing about animals, I'm coming from disabled people, you know, into veterans and into animals, did it change or did it allow you to say stuff that you couldn't say when you were writing about humans? And also, if this process that you are telling us is very like deep into that, did it change your way of or how you are thinking of writing in the future, Because I don't know if in the previous cases where you're also like doing this kind of like shocking or sarcasm that you were talking, and I don't know if that is something that you will continue, or this topic in particular is the one that allowed this kind of approach to be done. So it's about that kind of like how this study or like writing around animals allow you to do some stuff that maybe you were not able to do in your writing.
I mean, that's a great thing. Like, it took me a while to get used to writing about animals and about animal institutions. I remember, like, at one point, there were certain animals, and I would write, and I would kind of, I was like, do you know what this animal is? They're like, no, not really. Like, okay. Like, I need to define animal, like this species, because not everyone knows it. I think the one thing about writing about animals that's difficult, or at least like for me, is that it's not quite this. It used to be called like human-animal studies, right? Because the idea was like you're always studying the kind of relationship between humans and animals. And when I started writing about zoos, like I would kind of go through this whole thing and say like, wow, there aren't that many animals in this, right? And because I'm talking about architecture, I'm talking about labor practices, I'm talking about those kinds of things. Because of the way people have these intimate emotional attachments to animals, that allows me to say things that can allow me to be more pointed, right? That can allow me to be more, take the big swings in terms of like making grand statements about like what things are and so forth. So just the very thing that can potentially turn someone off can turn someone on, right? You know, so like I've had various animal rights podcasts, like they love the book, you know, because there's like, yeah, finally saying some, you know, all these things. So, so there are times in which I have to, with animals, kind of pull back. But, you know, there are so many questions or so many sentences in this book that if I could, like, if I took out animal and I put in disabled veteran, the sentence still works, right? You know, some disabled veterans are considered more important than others, and none are more, you know, like, I ripped that sentence off from my old book, you know, because so many of the kinds of ways in which, you know, people are set into hierarchies, they're classified, they're rendered valuable or valueless, they're seen or not seen, hidden or not hidden, you know, all of that, you know, applies to disabled veterans. I should say that disabled veterans are by far the best, you know, so this idea that you can't say things about, you can say anything about disabled veterans, right? And here's why, right? Who is against disabled, like if you ask like, who's against zoos, right? Some people are like, oh, I'm against zoos. Who's against disabled veterans? Anybody raise your hand? Even if you are you gonna raise your hand, right? You can say the nastiest things in the world about like American society and about racism, about how we leave our vets behind and like all these things. And like, you know, America, you know, it says it talks a big game, but it always lets them down. And if you put at the end, you know, see disabled veterans, you're good. You can't say that about trans people. You can't say that about like, you know, all these other things. Like there's no one in the world who is against disabled veterans. So it's a perfect vehicle for you to talk about all kinds of things. And yet, so without being at all controversial, like there's nothing controversial. So I can talk with like the most left groups about disabled veterans, they're all on board. I can talk about the most right groups about disabled veterans, they're all on board. Because the idea is that the figure at the center of it, the disabled veteran, is a figure that is in theory valued. And what I'm going to show you is that in practice is not. And that I think is powerful for people. Even if they only understand that on a kind of like, thank you for your service level. Like, that's not right. You know, like, that shouldn't be. And like, yeah, that shouldn't be. And then that allows me to talk about, and by the way, same thing goes for this, and this. With animals and zoos, it's more difficult. You know, and this is the difficult thing. Well, like, if I do this whole thing and people say, I like zoos. I took my kid to zoos. Like, are you saying that? What are you saying? And that's tough. Like, but what I would say is that when you have people dealing with the worst possible thing we can imagine, like what's the worst thing in the 20th century? You know, you know what? This thing I just went through, you know, I'm searching around for metaphors for what this thing means, and I got one. It's the zoo. This thing, this worst possible thing, the zoo is like it. I just hope that the next time you're thinking about the zoo, you remember that, and you're like, what does that even mean? If the people who are trying to imagine the worst thing on earth think of the zoo, I don't know, should I keep going? Like, how do I make sense of that? And so that's what I hope ultimately people take away from it. It's not a terribly interesting point, you know, but it's kind of like a moral point. And at this point in my career, I guess that's what I'm about.
So I know we have more questions in the room. We probably have time for one more question, but we have just a couple minutes left. So go ahead, Daniel.
Your comment made, or your talk made me think about how zoos can be barometers of stability, especially in civilized societies. And when we think about times of plenty, things are good, right? When we think about times of war, things get bad, and they get bad in zoos. That's I think your canary in the coal mine reference, right? So when violence becomes inevitable, as in a war, do you think zoos become some kind of symbol or metaphor for how the society's values come forth? For example, marginalized groups and disabled, how we treat our zoos during that time, or how we treat the organisms within that zoo, how we deal with the zoo in these times. Do you think that is it just exposes that, or is that something that's normalizes?
That's the thesis of the book. Like that's exactly what I'm trying to say. You know, that's ultimately what we do, right? And you know, like all of these questions about rationing, about like what kind of hunger matters, whose hunger matters. These questions about, you know, I have a chapter in the book on the London Zoo in the first hours of the war, and the London Zoo basically does it basically serves as kind of like a microcosm of the city, right? So, you know, the first thing it does is prepare. So it brings in all of these air raid precautions, sandbags, they do drills, they do, you know, everyone is armed, like let's get ready in case these things happen. The morning of the zoo, the morning of the war, the zoo evacuates some of its main animals to a zoo outside the city called Whipsnade, right? So the panda, one of the elephants, that sort of thing, in exactly the way they also evacuated 1.5 million British children through the empire. And if you've seen Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? That's, you know, and then they got to the killing, right? So, you know, in other words, like the zoo essentially does exactly what the city does, right? It says like we're all in it. We're trying to do exactly the sort of thing, and so. our zoos open as a sign of defiance, as a sign of victory, as a sign of like, we are not going to forget about who we are. And so we're going to keep our zoos open, and we're going to feed our animals even during the siege of Leningrad. This is why I think zoos are interesting, right? Because they are viewed as these barometers of what the nation can be and how the nation could and should react in times of trauma, right? You know, in Ukraine just over a couple years ago, like in the early days of the Russian invasion, there was, you know, very famous stories about people going into zoos in Kharkiv, in the big animal park there, taking the animals, you know, putting them into vans and then driving them all the way across Ukraine down to Poland and Romania, right? And these got international press. There's actually a documentary about this. And basically this was saying, see, this is, you know, and the idea was that the Russians are coming in to steal Ukraine's animals, which they did, and the Ukrainians are valiantly trying to save their animals and rescue them and get them to safety. And so this is a sign that Ukraine is good and Russia is bad, right? You know, and so this idea of how you treat animals and how you treat your zoo animals says a lot about you as a nation. This idea proliferated throughout World War II, right? As people, you know, especially in the United States, like would say, see, look at them over there. Look what they're doing to their animals, right? We're not, one big thing, it was called the September Holocaust, but basically in September 1939, over 400,000 British pets were killed. Then they were killed by the Home Office told pet owners that you need to bring in your budgies and your rabbits and your cats and dogs, kill them, or kill them with a, you know, like a bolt pistol, like if you've seen, you know, No Country for Old Men, like shoot them in the head. And so over 400,000 of them died. And they did for sacrifice because the idea was like we shouldn't be spending food on our pets. Americans at the time said, that's not the American way. Like, we don't kill our dogs here in America. Like, our dogs are man's best friend, right? And so they kind of looped into this idea of like nationalism and patriotism and the idea of like, you know, yeah, the Europeans might kill their dogs, but not us. Like, this is the, you know, and so people kind of, you know, read a lot into these ideas. And so how you treat your animals, how you treat your zoos say a lot about this. But, you know, someone took one of my readers took me to task because I mentioned in the introduction at one point, I said, like, so, you know, being an animal in World War II was the worst thing you could be. And she said, really, that's worse than being a Jewish person, you know, in World War II? And I was like, yeah. I mean, like, being an animal is always the worst thing you can be, right? And that's what I wanted to kind of, and that's a hard argument to make to people, right? You know, because even in the good times, we still have these ideas about, yeah, it's perfectly fine to slaughter them, and, you know, and so that was again an idea that I had to deal with very carefully about, because again, you know, there's another great book, I can't remember the name, about was this Holocaust in the Hen House is one, but there's another, about making these kind of, making the connection between slavery and the treatment of animals, right? And so the dreaded comparison is what it's called. And so like I always, throughout this, I had to walk up against like that dreaded comparison idea, not because I didn't believe it, but because of trying to sort of, people hold on to these comparisons, you know, in a way that's, you know, we don't always act like kind of academics who are understanding these things, you know, in a classroom. Like we read them through our own histories, and so yeah. Oh, thanks.
Thank you very much, John, for your presentation.
Oh, no problem.
Although the talk was titled writing a sad animal story, there's nothing sad about the presentation. if anything at all, you've given us much to think about the next time we visit the zoo. We are meeting this evening at 6 p.m. Rising Silos, to hang out with John. Come around with your family, friends. After all, it's Friday. Thank God it's Friday, right? So let's all meet at Rising Silos at 6 p.m. Thank you all very much. Thank you, folks online. We'll see you all next week.
Can I have a quick announcement? Right. So my colleague and I have a new edited collection in the works. It's called Wanted, Dead or Alive, The Animal Trade and American Empire. We have a couple of slots left open. So if you know of someone, or if you are someone who works on the animal trade and American empire, particularly if you can write accessibly, almost even from a historical perspective, that would be helpful. Or about COVID. We're lacking a COVID chapter. Yeah. So, but anyway, I just want to throw that out there. So if anyone, if you know of anyone, or like I said, let me know. So, all right. Oh, thank you.
So Oliver will take you.